May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our salvation. Amen. The stairway is not a thing of gleaming strands, a radiant evanescence for angels' feet that only glance in their tread and need not touch the stone. It is of stone, a rosy stone that takes a glowing tone of softness only because behind it the skies are doubtful, a doubting night grey. A stairway of sharp angles, solidly built, one sees that the angels must spring down from one step to the next, giving a little lift of the wings. And a man climbing must scrape his knees and bring the grip of his hands into play. The cut stone consoles his groping feet. Wings brush past him. The poem ascends. The poetry of Denis Levertov is full of angels. Sometimes, as here, they belong to a recognizable biblical story. Sometimes they are entirely unfamiliar. They always signal, as do biblical angels, something about the transcendent, the presence of God. But what I love about the poem that I've just read, Jacob's Ladder, is the way that Levertov entirely upends the biblical story. As we heard in Genesis, Jacob dreams of a ladder between earth and heaven, with the angels of God ascending and descending, an idea of the angels as God's messengers sent to earth to do God's will, a story which Jesus picks up when he's speaking to Nathanael. And this is absolutely right. That is the image of God, of the angels of God in the Bible, as God's messengers, sent from earth to heaven to do God's will. But Levertov says that the ladder between earth and heaven isn't just for angels, it's also for us. Human beings too can ascend and descend. We can approach heaven. As the Archdeacon has told us, this happens in and through Jesus. But what happens in and through Jesus is the fulfillment of what human beings were created to be, human potential to be creatures who participate in the life of heaven. Jesus is the one who opens the way, but we can glimpse the life of heaven in many ways. For Levertov, this happens through poetry, and I certainly also find poetry a window to the transcendent, and perhaps you do too. But there are other ways too to ascend the ladder of the angels: art or music or architecture, or above all, liturgy and the sacraments. Jacob's dream of angels is a precursor to a vision. The presence of angels prepares him for the presence of God. Later in his story, again by night, he would meet another angel, or perhaps again God, and on the eve of making one of the most momentous decisions of his life, physically wrestle with a creature of transcendence, someone belonging to heavenly reality. The physicality of that story reminds us that when we describe angels accurately as pure spirit, we're not saying that they are wafty creatures of air, or willowy figures who can't carry anything heavier than a lily, like the Gabriel on the reredos of the high altar. The angel with whom Jacob wrestles is a formidable opponent of commanding physicality. Like the angelic ladder in Levertov's poem, solid enough to scrape the climber's knees, angels, creatures of spirit, of transcendence, holy creatures of heaven, are more, not less, real and solid than our material selves in our material world. Indeed, when biblical angels appear to humans, they greet them, as we all know from the story of Gabriel greeting Mary, with "Do not be afraid." That reality, beyond human understanding, is almost too much for humans to bear. Our response to this might be to leave angels well alone. If they are not the fat-winged babies of Renaissance and Baroque art as modelled on our font, or the willowy creatures of air as modelled on our reredos, or the guardian angels of popular imagination, or indeed the beloved dead of post-Christendom? Should we just say that angels are strange and beyond our understanding and leave it at that? That is probably better than a focus on these popular and wrong ideas of angels, but I think if we did, we would be missing something. Because the poem describes the angel's staircase as inviting. It's built for angels, it's more real than our reality, but it still invites us to climb. Because we are creatures who belong to heaven, or at least have the potential to belong to heaven, as well as being creatures of earth. That's what we experience above all in liturgy, in the sacraments, that real reality, the physicality of bread and wine, bearing witness to the realness of the life of heaven. When we sing the Sanctus, we are joining explicitly in the worship of heaven, using the words that the angels used to worship God, which Isaiah heard in his vision of heaven in Isaiah 6. In lockdown, when we were all cut off from gathering in the Eucharist, when priests presided alone and congregations watched or listened online, I was comforted by the idea attributed to the 11th century Bishop Peter Damian, that every time the priest says, "Lift up your hearts," hosts of angels join in the reply, "We lift them to the Lord." Some of you will know the Church of St. Michael and All Angels in New Marston, just up the road. Behind their altar, they have a wall painting of angels with their coloured wings and floating chiffon dresses swirling around a cross where bread and wine are lifted. And when the priest stands behind the altar and lifts the chalice and the bread, she is visibly joining in that worship of heaven. And when the congregation share the bread and wine, they are partaking of the bread that has become bread of heaven. This is true everywhere, at every altar. The painting in St. Michael's just makes it more visible. When the archdeacon stands behind the altar in a few minutes and lifts the bread and the cup, he will be standing in heaven, worshipping at the throne of God, just as he is standing here on earth and making the transcendent present to us. And when we receive the bread and or the wine, we receive the food of heaven. None of this is new, but that's part of the point of the Christian year. As we cycle through seasons and feast days, we hear the same stories and the same truths again and again, because, to quote another poet, humankind cannot bear very much reality. The reality represented by the angels, the reality of transcendence and of God, is something that we can only grasp briefly, like flashes of sunlight. Each time we go through the cycle of the year and the feasts, we can, we hope, glimpse a tiny bit more. Each time we approach the altar in the presence of the angels, we receive one more tiny taste of that reality, made present in bread and wine. One day we will stand in the presence of God, surrounded by the saints and the angels, and know fully, even as we are fully known. But until then, let us come to worship, to lift our voices as the angels lift theirs, to glimpse God's glory in word and in beauty, to open our hands and our hearts to God and receive the bread of heaven. And as we do, the angels spring down to meet us on their sharp-cut staircase, and we ascend.